Hello, ladies, and welcome to this month's virtual Girly Book Club meeting. I want to kick this off by letting you know about our exciting giveaways we're going to have throughout our meeting tonight. You may know about our partnership with Book Trip, and they have provided us with some amazing prize packs to give away, each including the following 4 books. We've got We Were Strangers, An End to Upside Down Thinking, 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die, and it's a hefty one, so there's going to be some good recos here. And as well, we've also got The Only Woman in the Room, which if you're following us on Instagram, you might have seen a sneak peek of this on there today on today's post. So we've got those 4 amazing books along with a very handy book bag to carry them all. So to win, simply type in your question for Balli in the chat box here. The first 4 members to submit a question for Balli will each win a prize pack containing those 4 books and the book bag with it. So keep an eye on the Girly Book Club page where we tell you more about exciting contests we've got coming up. We've got one coming up tomorrow on our Instagram as well, which is exciting. So if you have that, join us. We're really excited to kick this off tonight. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Balli Kaur Jaswal. Balli is the author of 3 novels. Her first book, Inheritance, earned her the Best Young Australian Novelist Award in 2014, and her second book, Sugar Bread, was a finalist for the 2018 Singapore Literature Prize. And of course, she's also the author of this month's GBC title, Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight. We're so grateful.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really honored that you chose this book for your book club, and I'm really excited to answer any questions and discuss the book with you all.
Amazing. We're very excited. For those who have not read it by chance, I've seen a little chatter on our pages of people intending to get their reading in this week before some meetings next week. So for those who have not read the story, what can you tell us about the novel?
So the novel is, firstly, I can tell you what it's not. It's not a collection of erotic stories for Punjabi widows. That's the most common question I get. It's about a group of Punjabi widows who start off taking a simple literacy class, which sort of evolves into an erotic storytelling club. When they discover that what they have in common is that there are things that they've always wanted to talk about, and that there are things that they desired that they were never allowed to really discuss, and so that it kind of the club, the erotic storytelling club, kind of evolves from there.
Amazing. Thank you for that. That was great. I want to chat a little bit about the characters in the novel. Did you find that any of them were inspired by people in your personal life or people in your community when you were creating and developing these characters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'd grown up with sort of a fascination of I was quite interested in the older women in the community, because on one hand they were sort of invisible in a way, like especially the widows. They were not really seen as a huge part of things, but on the other hand they were quite respected, and they ruled things, and they sort of upheld the moral codes for us girls, like a good girl doesn't do this, or a good girl doesn't talk like that. So we had that. There's kind of like the double-edged sword to being a widow in this marginalized community. So I was really fascinated with them. I was fascinated with how their views, how they discovered sexuality, I suppose, because they would have at some point, whether they did so enthusiastically or whether it was something that was it had to be kind of explained to them or introduced to them in a way that us modern women would sort of cringe at. I was really interested in the fact that they had children, and they had been married, so they had sex, and I was just very curious about what that would have been like for them, what that discovery would have been like for them, because it certainly would have been very different from the way it was for us on the playground or reading our Judy Blume novels or something. So I think they were kind of the inspiration for the novel. And then Nikki, the main character, I think she inspired me as well, because I suppose she is a lot like me when I was in my 20s. She has a very blinkered view of feminism, and this very sort of us and them approach to things, which is like there's a right way and there's a wrong way. And she probably doesn't recognize how much privilege she comes from, that she's had the education and the experience and the freedom to be allowed to kind of explore her options and understand a bit more about her sexuality than these women did. So I just thought that generational gap would be really interesting to explore, among other things in the novel.
Mm-hmm. And to touch upon that, we have a question from Jen. She asked if any of the events in the story or aspects of Nikki's character were based on your personal life.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think directly, but a lot of the conversations that Nikki has with Olive about, her sort of surprise at these women and the stories that she's uncovering, I think that that was sort of inspired by conversations that I had with my friends about that older generation of women, and how they probably don't talk about these things, that they don't have these experiences. So I say it was inspired in that way. I also, there was a lot, there have been in the last couple of years, a lot of conversations on social media about modern feminism and about the South Asian community and how women in the South Asian community are speaking up. And I think those things, I drew a lot from those sorts of things, when I saw them and when they were relevant. I can't think of like a specific, like I didn't run an erotic storytelling class for Punjabi Widows, unfortunately. So I don't think anything was directly based on my personal life, but I did spend a lot of time in South Hall getting to know, because I think there's another question about the setting. I spent quite a bit of time in South Hall when I lived in England for a year, and it was this funny thing where I felt this real pull to be there when I was there, but also I was quite desperate to leave every time I got there, because it really felt stifling as well, because it was this great place where this community really, was very close knit. You had the sense of, you had this really overwhelming sense of family when you were there, even if you weren't directly related to people around you. It felt like home in a lot of ways. But then also it felt like home, like it felt like you're around your family a lot. And it was frustrating. And there were all these rules about what you could say and do that just felt so, it felt very stifling and felt so out of place in London. So it felt as if I was going into a different world every time I went there. And then every time I stepped out into London, it felt like I could breathe a little. So I kind of thought a lot about that tension between wanting to be in this immigrant enclave with all of the benefits of community, but then also feeling like this enclave could also then turn against you if you didn't follow the rules.
Yeah, very interesting. And to just follow up on Juliet's question about the setting, how did you decide on London as your main setting?
London has a really significant and thriving Punjabi Sikh community with different generations as well. So it's not just a recent migration. The migration's been happening since the 50s, and so it's a very sort of deep-rooted migrant identity there. And I wanted to explore that because so many people, I think, left London in the 1950s and 60s, and moved to the UK, which would have been so different. And then kind of settled in this one area where they figured out that they actually didn't have to assimilate too much. They could actually, kind of preserve all of the ideals and all the values and all the traditions of their homeland. And as a result, it kind of feels like a place that has stopped in time a little bit. When you step into South Hall, some of the traditions and the values are they're at par with the way a village in India would be in decades ago, like even villages in India. Like even some people in villages in India have moved on from some of those traditions. So I found that really fascinating, because I think in other places, like I did consider setting it in the US, for example, and I think the migration pattern has just been different there, so that when Punjabis and when people generally migrated to the US, they generally spread out a lot more. They weren't all concentrated in this one area that just felt very, very much physically like it was Punjab transplanted in another country. And I wanted to get that East-West tension down. So I didn't consider setting it in Singapore, where I'm from, because I think the contrast between cultures wouldn't be stark enough. Like it would be sort of the Punjabi community versus the East Asian sort of dominant culture in Singapore, which it's there's too many similarities and there's too much overlapping in tradition and in culture, that I thought London was sort of perfect. Also, Bend It Like Beckham is one of my favorite movies. So I was really excited to just revisit that comedy and that setting.
That's very interesting points, and I love that you also picked it because of your love for the movie Bend It Like Beckham, yeah. Which was a really great film, when it came out. I want to talk about the range of the beliefs from the characters. They all had there really was such a wide range in their beliefs. So what compelled you to convey all of the differences of views and opinions?
I wanted to I suppose I wanted to step away from the initial view that I had, that all of the older women and all the widows in the Punjabi community were the same. Like if I was going to have these women telling their stories, then they were going to have diverse experiences. There was going to be more than met the eye. And with these women, I also wanted to kind of showcase the variety of levels of comfort with sort of modern ideas and sexuality. And I wanted to surprise the reader in a way that I've been surprised, in the past, with learning that sometimes, much older women tend to be, more expressive about their sexuality. Like Arvinder is less conservative than her prudish daughter, Pritham. And Sheena is kind of trapped between these two. She feels like the widows are the only people who understand her, but she's also young and she wants to date. So I figured that if I was going to tell the stories of these women and have these women be sort of individual, fleshed out characters, then they needed to also be quite distinct from each other in how well they take to this idea of expressing their sexuality, and what stories from their past they had to share as well. So it's not just that one sort of uniform story of going from being more conservative to more modern. There are different shades of it.
Not to play favorites, but did you have any favorite characters from your own story?
It's hard to say. I think I liked them all in different ways. And when I wrote the first draft, they were quite they weren't distinct enough from each other. So I think it was in the revision process that I really started to get to know them and give them a few more things to say and a bit more backstory. I think I really like Arvinder. I think I mentioned her before, just because she's so feisty and what she says is so unexpected. I also strangely had a soft spot for Tarampal, because I felt very sorry for her, and I felt that what she went through was very difficult, and she was sort of robbed of a childhood and then robbed of a chance to really be an adult in a lot of ways. And she had to she makes some pretty harsh choices, and she's complicit in some things, but I also just felt very sad that circumstances kind of were such that she didn't really see any other option.
Yeah, she really was a complex character. You know, as much as she embodies sort of the patriarchy, she also seems to really be driven by love and have that soft side to her as well. Why do you feel that she was such an important character to the storyline? You know, what made you decide that you wanted to include her character and her storyline that came with her into this novel?
I think I felt it was really important to remind readers and remind myself as well that there are women in the community who uphold these patriarchal values, and in fact there are the women are sort of used as tools, I think, by the men, because the men aren't necessarily in the spaces that the women are in. And so, you know, the more vulnerable women who've been kind of steeped in these beliefs for so long that they think that they're right, they're the ones who really kind of go around and I suppose manage the behaviors and police the behaviors of other women, because they have so much access to what those other women are doing. So I was interested in how that how that looked. I also wanted to explore the idea that a woman could be so steeped in these values, so much so that she thought that they were justified. And what did it mean to be to think that it's right that you're oppressed, to think that it's your place to be oppressed? It's I think it is quite a common scenario when someone's whole life has been kind of devoted to listening to men and to being in service to men or any other sort of oppressive power. They're not then going to have this awakening so suddenly and say, you know, oh, you know, my whole life has been for nothing, you know, or I've been doing all of this for somebody else. No, they're going to justify, you know, they're going to justify that life, and they're going to want that life for other people because they think, well, this is the right way to be. This is the way that our society should work, and this is the way there should be order in our society. So I was really interested in exploring that. It's sort of like brainwashing in a way, and I was very interested in what makes a person think that way, and whether they do ever come out of that way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before we dive into some of the lighter fare within the book, you also dove into some pretty, you know, serious issues and injustices, namely the violence against the women and the cover-ups in the honor killings. Why was it important to you to include these much larger issues into this book?
I started off just wanting to write about the erotic stories, and then it just occurred to me that if the women were talking about desire, and if they were starting to find their voices and talking about the things that they hadn't been allowed to talk about before, then other things were going to come up. So they were going to realize that they couldn't be silent anymore about other things. So they're going to start speaking up, because that same kind of excitement around, you know, sharing secrets and sharing fantasies would probably lead them to also talk intimately about other things, and there's some pretty big secrets in their community, and some pretty some other unsaid things that, you know, they've kind of been taught not to discuss. So I just felt that was pretty natural, and also the same forces that push down, that, you know, silence these women from discussing their desires and their fantasies and their sexuality. Those same forces are also causing the violence, and so I felt like it was kind of a domino effect. Like when the women, you know, feel more empowered to talk about their sexual fantasies, then it only made sense that they would start questioning other things in their community as well, and just start toppling the whole patriarchy.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for providing more insight there. I am going to switch over because we've got a lot of questions specifically about the erotic stories. So there's no way we can't not talk about them. What I personally loved about them was that each story really seemed to give a sense of the woman who wrote it. And we got a different kind of glimpse into their views. You know, some of the erotic stories were more modest and romantic, and some of them were a little bit more descriptive and sensual. What was it like to write these really varying stories?
It was fun. It was interesting because I'm actually not a big erotic story reader or writer, so it was all pretty new to me, and I had to figure out how to do that. So I had to kind of research quite a bit and look and you know, just as there are different sort of there's a variety to the women, there are also a variety of story types in erotic storytelling, and there's also just different voices and different kind of themes and things like that. So I kind of had to find my voice first, and then think a little bit about each of the women and how their voices would be reflected in the stories. So it was an interesting process, and it was pretty fun. I have to say, though, it wasn't once I kind of got the idea down, I just kind of wrote it down, and I tried not to do too much editing of the actual stories when I wrote them down, because I figured this is a creative writing workshop and these women aren't expert writers, and I wanted that kind of amateur tone to them. So the stories as they're written down are pretty much the way they were when I started to write them, or when I first wrote them. They weren't revised very much for that reason.
That's great. That makes so much sense. We've got a question from our host, Ariana from Denver. She asked if you came up with all the erotic stories, or if you had any help from any Punjabi widows.
No, unfortunately, I haven't. I didn't get any erotic stories for Punjabi widows. I did talk to a couple of, well, one in particular. I talked to the grandmother of a friend of mine who lives in Southall. That was more about like the logistics of like, when did you get married, and when did you go and stay with your husband, and when did you kind of know what to do with your husband? Like we kind of you know, tiptoed around it a little bit, because she got a little bit uncomfortable, and she's chased us out of the kitchen a few times. So that was mostly the extent of my interviewing. The other things were just observations and my imagining of what went on behind closed doors, and the sorts of things that they might actually talk about. But also I did draw from this really interesting thing that happens in this community, and I've heard it happens in other conservative communities as well, where when the women get together and it's just women and there's a mood of like celebration, like I think it depends on the context, these older women are really, really crude. Like they make really crude jokes. They've got lots of like really dirty songs and like rhymes and stuff. So I was kind of aware that that knowledge was in there somewhere, and I wanted to, I was interested into tapping into it and thinking about, well, if I put them all in a safe space where it's just women, would they all talk to each other the same way? And I think they absolutely would. If you excuse me, I'm just going to move back to the couch because my son's eating here. He's going to distract us.
Okay.
Let's turn on the light. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Keeping it going right along, we've got a question from Joanne from Hamilton, Canada. Which erotic story was your favorite and why?
Oh, I suppose the Taylor one, which had an element of magic realism to it. I just liked the idea of this kind of fabric, you know, becoming a woman, and the just the kind of the fantasy of it. So it felt like a fantasy within a fantasy. It was just fun to write. The details of the way things looked, and the whole setting of that story was just really fun to write. But I also liked the story that kind of started. I don't think it actually ended up going anywhere. Where one of the widows was discussing or she was basing. I think it was Preetham who was basing the story off of something that she'd seen on like one of the late night channels. I thought that was very funny because she was sort of trying to be coy about it, and she was pretending the story was just from her imagination when it clearly was something that she watched on TV.
Yeah, I love that moment when she got called out for it, and they were like, "This isn't authentic." We've got a question here from Jen asking, she notes that it was interesting how the lesbian erotic love story ended on a rather dark note after the woman who was composing it got a negative reaction from some of the other women in the class. So Jen asks if the turn in her story in the second half was meant to reflect her discomfort at the reactions of the other women.
I never really thought of that, actually. I think I left that sort of that story kind of open-ended and left it because I wanted to sort of move on to the reactions of the women. I'm trying to figure out. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out that question. The turn, if you wonder if the turn in the story took. If you wonder if the turn in the story was meant to reflect her discomfort at the reactions of the other women, no, not really. I suppose I understand that, yeah, because she did kind of come back with the second half of the story. I just remembered that. Yep, I think that's inevitable, that when we write for an audience and the audience gives us their input, it changes the shape of our story, or it affects the way we decide to write the story. And I wanted to include a story that, because all the stories were about heterosexual relationships, and I wanted to include a story that would be, for these women, a bit out there and a bit different, and to kind of gauge their reactions to it. And I think it's a little bit like when Nikki is a little bit too bold with the women about how there's that the older women who want to come into the class, and Nikki kind of goes and she tries to throw the door open and just welcome them in, and then they run away. It's a little bit like that, like introducing a lesbian story to these women who've just kind of gotten used to the idea of talking about sex. I think it intimidates some of them. One of them just like runs out of the room and never comes back. But then again, a few, in a surprising way, a few of them go, this is something that used to happen in my village. And, sometimes the women would get together because the men couldn't satisfy them. So I think that there was that effect of shock on some of the women. And then I think that the aftershocks are where the conversations happen, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Thank you for the insight into that. We have some more. I'm just going to keep the questions going. We're getting so many great questions from everyone that's attending tonight. So Angela Carson asks, what is your favorite author or book, and why? A different direction here.
Yeah, I have so many. I would say an author that I have always loved and whose work probably inspired me to write this is Judy Blume. Because I think she was one of the first people I ever read who talked about things that you weren't supposed to talk about, and that excitement that we used to have in class. And I think everyone, this is pretty universal for anyone who read Judy Blume, that when you would like turn the corner of the page and then you would bring it to class and like show all your friends, like you'd read all the dirty passages from the Judy Blume books and you'd pass it around. That sort of excitement of discovery and secrets and reading about things you weren't supposed to read about and hiding it. I think that was that feeling of women getting together and doing that was sort of where the seeds were planted for this novel as well. So especially like Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, and Forever, which was that book about teen sex that was banned and and that teenagers loved. I think that's really fascinating.
Love it. I love that. That was, an inspiration for this book. Judy Bloom. Simone wants to know, do you think you would ever write a sequel to the book? She would love to see what happened to Nikki.
I really wanted to write a sequel initially, actually. I was told to take a little bit of a break from writing it because I think the characters were a bit too fresh in my mind, and I think all I wanted to do was kind of continue with them. And that's probably not a good reason to write a sequel, just because you want to hang out with the characters a bit longer. Yeah, I have so many plans in my mind though for Nikki and Jason, and then for Mindy, and her marriage and kind of adjusting to a traditional marriage in a sort of modern way, and also like what these widows get up to, like what other injustices they fight, because now they've become empowered. They're gonna sort of put the men in their place, maybe. So I'd love to write a sequel, but probably not. It's not going to be a very quick follow-up.
In this hypothetical sequel, would you write from the same characters' point of views? Would it still come from Nikki and Kawinder, or would you maybe go into a different character?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. I suppose, yeah, I think I would introduce new characters, and then I suppose they would be in the novel, and they might take a bigger part of the narrative. Yeah, there's an idea.
Done. Sold.
Yeah.
Well, I know you're working on something else. I'm going to touch upon that in a minute. But Simone asks, what has the feedback been like from the Punjabi community?
It's actually been pretty good. I'm surprised because I was expecting backlash, and if there has been, I haven't heard of it. So no one's protested my novel directly to me. I think there is this thing, because it's such the Punjabi community is a minority community. I think there is this idea of that representation in any way is a good thing. So seeing the word Punjabi in a title has made some people really excited. They're like, hey, that's me, that's my identity. And so maybe those more conservative people have ignored the whole erotic part. As I like to tell people, when I first told my dad that I was writing this novel and he asked me what's the title, and I said Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows, he said, oh, okay, Exotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. And I said, no, Erotic Stories. And he said, Exotic Stories? And I said, no. And he went, Stories for Punjabi Widows. So he just ignored like the whole description at the front. And so I think that's, those more conservative people who would maybe protest the content, I think they're quite excited about the idea of Punjabis being, sort of in mainstream fiction. And I have gotten emails and messages from people, some older women, some older men, saying thank you for writing about this, and this is a story that needs to be heard, or it's about time that someone spoke up for these women. So that's really exciting, and again, I didn't expect that at all. So that's been really nice.
Yeah, that's definitely great feedback to hear, for sure. This is always a hot topic between our members, so I'm going to ask, do you know anything about a film or TV adaptation of this story?
Yeah, I know. I know as much as anyone else knows, which is that the film rights were sold to Scott Free Productions, like 2 years ago, and that things are in the works. I think it sounds like it's a very long process, and I think I get updated when you know there is any news to share. The last I spoke to them, we talked to a screenwriter who was adapting and doing some research. So she lives near Southall, I think, and she was doing a little bit of research there. What I do know is that they really want to maintain the integrity of the novel, and they really want to, you know, not make it sort of an exotic or exoticized idea of these other people in London. They really want it to sort of invite viewers into that world. So you're not simply a spectator, but you're involved in the story, which feels really nice. I think that's what I wanted for the story as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, we are waiting with bated breath.
Thank you. So am I.
In the meantime, I know you are working on your 4th novel now. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm actually just in the today I'm going to send it off to my editor because I've done the last little corrections. It's called The Unlikely Adventures of the Shergill Sisters, and it's about 3 British Indian sisters who go on a pilgrimage to India to carry out their mother's last wishes. So the mother has passed away, and she's asked them to take this pilgrimage. Like all road trips, it just doesn't go as planned. And I was when I wrote Erotic Stories, I was really I had a lot of fun writing the dynamic between the sisters, between Nikki and Mindy. And so I wanted to continue writing about the dynamics between sisters. They don't get along. So part of it is their mother's way of kind of tricking them into traveling together and spending some time together, and lots of past secrets and hurts and sort of untold things come to surface while they're traveling.
Well, very exciting. Glad to get that update and know that, it's maybe a little further along than I think.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, it comes out, I believe it comes out in March or April next year. So not too far away. Yeah.
Exciting. I can't wait. We'll definitely be picking that one up. What can you tell us about your writing processes?
I kind of move around the house, sort of, wherever my child is. I move to the other room. I try to I try to write every day when I'm working on something. I try to hit, if I'm kind of working towards a deadline, then I try to hit a certain word count every day. I don't usually meet that word count. It is very ambitious. It's 1,000 words a day, and it's very ambitious. And I don't usually get there. If I do get there, then I need like a break for another 2 days. So it's more in the range of 500 words a day, I would say. But the goal is kind of to just get the writing down, like get it down before you get it right. Is usually the way I go. I think the most important thing is to just to show up, and to do the work, even if the work doesn't seem like it's coming easily to you, and even if it's just not if it's not going in the direction that you want it to. I do also think it's really important to start the day off well. So if I start the day off looking at social media or sitting around, not kind of getting my act together, then the day kind of follows from that. If I start the day with reading a bit of fiction, though, then I think the cogs start to turn, and my brain is then kind of switched to fiction mode. I also take a few walks usually during the day. That really clears my mind, and that helps a lot. So I try not to stay in the same place for too long in one day. That's more or less my writing process. I do have a notebook that I scribble in when I've got notes to myself or like planning, but I generally type. Like I don't do a lot of the actual writing of the story on paper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you find you are the type to craft an entire story before you sit down, or do you just have, like one idea and you just start writing and see where it takes you?
I tend to try to plan the arc of the story. It doesn't then go that way. Like the arc will like look like this in my notebook, and then this. So it doesn't often look the way I plan, but I do find it reassuring to know that there is this framework somewhere to aspire to, just like I aspire to that daily word count that doesn't happen. And often I know roughly what the ending will be, like not necessarily what the final scene will look like, but like by the end of the story, I want all of the characters in this place, or I want these people. I want the widows to be empowered to help other women in their community. So this general kind of a general sort of change in circumstances or values or whatever for characters. I have that sort of idea for the end of the novel, but everything that happens in between, I plan a little bit better as I go along. So as I, if I'm starting chapter 3, then maybe I can kind of look ahead to chapter 4 and say, well, I want this to happen here, but planning the whole thing doesn't really materialize.
Very interesting. All right. Thanks for sharing. I just want to wrap it up with a fun question. Give us a great book recommendation.
Ooh, okay. I am reading. So I have so many. I'm trying to think. I really, really enjoyed, and I think it's quite popular, Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. I thought that was a really, really good story, and it was really interesting. The issues in it were really interesting, but then it was also a page turner. Also about that struggle between sort of migrants and the majority of people in a suburb in the US. And then I recently read a novel called Severance by an author named, I think her name is Ling Ma. And it's really funny and strange. It's about this zombie virus. I know it sounds odd, but this virus kind of takes over. Like it comes from manufacturers in China, and it takes over in the US, and a lot of people are just kind of when they're afflicted by it, they're just very their emotions are all very repetitive, and they're very zombified in a way. And it's about this young woman who is the child of Chinese immigrants who sort of joins a group of traveling people as they try to get from New York to Chicago in the aftermath of this virus. And it was just really interesting. It was written with a lot of heart for a sort of an apocalyptic novel, and it was very funny, and it really captured loneliness in a really profound way, I thought, but it was also a real page turner. So that was an interesting one.
All right, thanks. Yeah, my curiosity is definitely piqued with Severance, and I can see the comments here happening, and everyone is loving your reco of Little Fires Everywhere. You said you need a book between this one and our November book, so that's going to be it. So that was great.
Cool.
So much. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us tonight. I will let you go. We're now, 45 minutes. We're so grateful for your time. It's been a wonderful month reading your novel, and can't wait to discuss in our book clubs next week. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading and being so enthusiastic about the novel. It means a lot to me. And thanks for your questions as well.
No problem. Thank you again for attending, and have a great night. Enjoy your son's birthday.
Thank you. I will.